The cowboy saved her from a ruthless gang and discovered they shared the same enemy. The sun was already low when the cowboy rode along the dusty road that cut through the open plains. The sky stretched wide above him, painted with soft shades of orange and gold. He rode without hurry, as if he had nowhere special to be and no reason to rush. People in nearby towns knew him only as a quiet traveler who worked hard, spoke little, and left before anyone could ask too many questions. He preferred it that way. His horse moved steadily beneath him, used to long rides and silent company. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Everything felt calm, but the cowboy had learned long ago that calm could change in a moment. As he reached a bend in the road near a stretch of broken fencing, he noticed movement far ahead. At first, he thought it was just riders passing through. Then he saw the dust rising too quickly, too sharply. Someone was being chased. He narrowed his eyes and slowed his horse. A young woman rode hard across the plain, her posture tense, her movements urgent. Behind her followed several riders, spread out in a line that showed planning rather than chance. They were not traveling together peacefully. They were hunting. The cowboy felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Trouble had a way of finding him even when he tried to avoid it. He could turn away. No one would blame him. The plains were full of stories that ended badly for those who stepped into someone else's fight. But something about the way the woman rode, determined yet desperate, stopped him from moving on. He guided his horse off the road and watched carefully. The riders behind her moved fast, closing the distance. He could see their intent even from afar. They were not trying to talk. He exhaled slowly. Without fully deciding, he turned his horse toward them. As the woman approached, her eyes widened at the sight of him. She looked uncertain, as if she could not tell whether he was friend or danger. He raised one hand calmly, signaling for her to follow his lead. She hesitated for only a second before steering toward him. When the riders behind realized she had reached another person, they spread out more aggressively. The cowboy quickly scanned the terrain. A narrow trail led toward a cluster of rocks and an old abandoned barn he remembered seeing years ago. It might offer enough cover to lose the pursuers. "Ride with me," he said quietly as she came close enough to hear. His voice was steady, leaving little room for argument. She nodded, breathless but alert. They turned together, pushing their horses toward the rocky path. The ground became uneven, forcing the riders behind them to slow slightly. The cowboy guided them through twists and turns, using knowledge gained from years of wandering. The sound of hooves behind them remained strong. Whoever chased her was skilled and determined. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, they reached the abandoned barn. Its roof sagged, and its walls were weathered by time, but it still offered shadow and cover. The cowboy led their horses around the back and into a small hollow hidden from open view. They dismounted quickly. The woman leaned against a wooden post, catching her breath. Dust clung to her clothes, and her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her voice low but sincere. He nodded once. "They won't give up easy." Her eyes flicked toward the open plains. Fear crossed her face, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I know." Silence settled between them. The cowboy did not ask questions immediately. He had learned that people revealed what they wanted when they were ready. The sound of riders passing in the distance made both of them freeze. They waited without speaking until the noise faded. Night came slowly, bringing cooler air and long shadows. The cowboy started a small fire hidden behind fallen boards to avoid being seen from afar. He offered her water and food from his saddlebag. She accepted carefully, watching him as if still unsure of his intentions. He noticed how she kept one hand near her bag at all times. Whatever she carried mattered to her. "What's your name?" she asked eventually. He gave only his first name. It was enough. She hesitated before sharing hers, as if each word required trust she had not yet decided to give. When she spoke, he sensed strength behind her tired eyes. They took turns keeping watch through the night. The cowboy listened to distant sounds, wind, insects, and once far-off voices that suggested the gang was still searching. He felt old instincts returning, skills he had buried when he chose a quieter life. Before dawn, she finally spoke more openly. "They won't stop," she said. "They need something from me." He looked at her calmly. "What?" She hesitated again. "Proof," she said finally. "Something they don't want anyone else to see." He did not press further. Instead, he studied the horizon. The rising sun revealed tracks in the dirt not far from their hiding place. The gang was closer than he liked. "We need to move," he said. They packed quickly and rode out just as the first light spread across the plains. The world felt different in daylight, less threatening, yet more exposed. As they traveled, small moments began to soften the tension between them. She noticed how he chose paths that avoided open ground. He noticed how she stayed alert despite exhaustion. By midday, they stopped near a stream to rest the horses. She washed dust from her face and stared at her reflection in the water as if searching for reassurance. "You didn't have to help me," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Maybe not. Then why did you?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Some things feel wrong if you walk away." She studied him, trying to understand the meaning behind his words. There was history there, but he did not explain it. As they resumed their journey, the cowboy felt a strange sense of familiarity growing. The names she mentioned when describing the gang sounded familiar, stirring memories he had tried to forget. He said nothing yet, but unease settled deeper within him. Late in the afternoon, they spotted smoke rising from a distant ridge. He guided them away from it, avoiding any sign of activity. The woman followed without question now, trusting his judgment more with each mile. When evening came again, they found shelter beneath a cluster of trees. The sky filled with stars, bright and endless. For the first time since meeting, she allowed herself to relax slightly. "They took everything from people," she said softly, almost to herself. "Homes, land." Hope, the cowboy, listened carefully. Each word pulled him closer to a truth he was not ready to face. As the fire burned low, he realized that helping her was no longer just about saving someone from a chase. Something bigger connected them, something hidden just beyond reach. He stared into the darkness, knowing that the road ahead would not be simple, and that turning back was no longer an option. Morning came slowly over the open land. A soft gray light spread across the sky, and the air felt cooler than the night before. The cowboy was already awake, sitting near the small fire that had burned down to ashes. He listened carefully to the silence around them. Out here, silence could mean safety, or it could mean someone was waiting. The young woman stirred from her sleep and sat up quickly, as if she expected danger at any second. When she saw him sitting calmly nearby, she relaxed just a little. "Did you hear anything?" she asked. "Only the wind," he replied. "But that doesn't mean they stopped looking." She nodded. She already knew that. They packed their things without wasting time. The horses were rested enough to travel again, though the journey ahead would not be easy. The cowboy studied the land before choosing their direction. He avoided the main road and instead led them toward rougher ground where tracks would be harder to follow. As they rode, the woman seemed lost in thought. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the horizon, the hills, the trees. She carried fear, but she also carried determination. The cowboy noticed that about her. She was not just running, she was holding on to something important. After several hours, they reached a narrow canyon with high stone walls on both sides. The path through it was tight and uneven, but it offered cover. The cowboy slowed his horse and turned slightly toward her. "If they're following, they'll have to come through here," he said. "We'll hear them." She looked at the canyon entrance behind them and then at the long path ahead. "Good," she said quietly. "I'm tired of always looking over my shoulder." There was strength in her voice now, not just fear. They continued through the canyon, the sound of hooves echoing softly off the stone walls. When they reached the other side, they stopped near a patch of trees beside a shallow stream. The horses drank while the two of them rested. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cowboy could sense that she was deciding whether to tell him more. Finally, she took a deep breath. "They control more than people think," she began. "It's not just random trouble. They pressure families to sell their land. If someone refuses, strange things start to happen. Fences get broken, supplies disappear, crops fail." The cowboy's jaw tightened slightly. He kept his expression calm, but inside old memories stirred. "I worked for a man once," she continued. "He refused to sell. He said the land belonged to his father and his father before him. A week later, his barn burned down. After that, he had no choice." The cowboy stared at the water flowing over small rocks. He had heard a story like that before. He had lived it. "Why are they after you?" he asked. She reached into her bag carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper wrapped in cloth. She did not open it fully, but he could see writing inside. "I found records," she said. "Lists of names, dates, payments. They're working with someone powerful, someone who signs papers and makes it look legal." The cowboy felt a heavy silence settle between them. "They don't know exactly what I have," she added. But they know I saw too much. He nodded slowly. Now it made sense. This was not a simple chase. This was about control. As they rested, a faint sound reached his ears. He lifted his head slightly. Hooves. Far away but moving steadily. He stood at once and moved to higher ground to look. Dust rose in the distance. "They found our trail," he said calmly when he returned. She stood quickly, her face tightening. "How far? Not far enough." They mounted their horses again. This time the pace was faster. The canyon had helped them for a while, but the open land ahead would be harder to cross unseen. The sun climbed higher, and heat began to press down on them. Sweat formed along the cowboy's brow, but his focus never wavered. He studied the land constantly, searching for any advantage. After some time, he spotted something ahead, an old windmill near what looked like a deserted ranch house. The structure leaned slightly, and the fence around it was broken, but it offered walls and possibly supplies. "We'll stop there," he said. They rode hard toward the ranch. As they approached, the cowboy's heart beat a little heavier. Something about the place felt familiar. They dismounted and led the horses behind the house. The building was empty, dust covering the floor and broken chairs scattered inside. The woman walked slowly through the doorway, looking around. "What happened here?" she whispered. The cowboy did not answer at first. He recognized the layout. He had once known a man who lived in a place like this. He stepped outside and looked at the land beyond the house. The fields were dry and abandoned. No signs of care remained. "They refused to sell," he said quietly. "That's what happened." She turned to him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You know this place?" He nodded once. "Not this exact ranch, but I've seen this story before." He walked to the old well and ran his hand along the worn wood. Memories he had buried began to rise. Years ago, he had owned a small piece of land himself. It had not been large, but it had been his. He had worked hard for it. Then pressure had started, offers that seemed generous at first. Then warnings. Then problems he could not explain. He had left before things grew worse. He told himself it was smarter that way, safer. But standing here now, he wondered if leaving had solved anything. Inside the house, the woman opened a drawer and found an old family photograph left behind. A smiling couple and 2 children stood in front of the ranch house when it was new. "They look happy," she said softly. "They were," he replied. Outside, the distant sound of riders grew louder. The cowboy's eyes sharpened. "We don't have much time." They quickly searched the house for anything useful. He found rope and a few tools. She refilled their water containers from a barrel that still held some rainwater. The riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch. There were several of them, spreading out again as they had before. The woman looked at the cowboy, fear returning to her face. "They'll surround us." "Not if we move first," he said. He studied the land quickly and made a decision. There was a narrow, dry creek bed behind the ranch that curved out of sight. If they moved fast enough, they could disappear before the riders fully closed in. "Stay close," he told her. They mounted and rode toward the creek bed just as the riders began descending the ridge. The sound of hooves thundered behind them, closer now than ever before. Dust filled the air. The cowboy guided his horse sharply into the dry creek bed, using its low ground to block the riders' view. They followed the winding path, branches brushing against them as they passed. For several tense minutes, the chase felt dangerously close, but the twists and turns of the creek worked in their favor. Finally, the sound behind them grew fainter. They slowed only when they were sure they had gained distance again. The woman looked back over her shoulder, breathing hard. "They won't stop," she said. "No," he agreed. "They won't." She met his eyes. "Then we can't just keep running." He saw something new in her expression, not just fear, but resolve. He thought about the abandoned ranch, the burned barns, the families forced away. He thought about his own past and how he had chosen to leave instead of stand. Maybe this time would be different. He looked ahead at the endless land stretching before them. "Then we find a way to stop them," he said quietly. For the first time since they met, they were not just 2 people escaping danger. They were beginning to move toward something larger, a shared fight neither of them had planned, but neither could ignore. The land stretched wide and quiet as they continued riding, but the silence between them felt different now. It was no longer filled with uncertainty alone. Something had changed after their narrow escape. They were no longer just traveling in the same direction. They were beginning to move with shared purpose. The cowboy guided their horses toward higher ground where the wind swept away tracks quickly. He remained alert, checking behind them often, but his thoughts were no longer focused only on avoiding danger. The woman's story had stirred memories he had tried to leave behind, and he knew he could not ignore the connection much longer. They rode for several hours without speaking much. The woman seemed to sense he was thinking deeply and did not interrupt. Finally, as they reached a ridge overlooking a vast valley, he slowed and brought his horse to a stop. Below them, scattered ranches dotted the land, some active, others abandoned. Fences leaned at odd angles and fields lay dry where crops once grew. He stared at the view for a long moment. "This looks familiar," he said quietly. She waited. "Years ago," he continued, "I owned land not far from a place like this. Small ranch, nothing special, but it was mine." She listened carefully, realizing he was sharing something important. "At first, everything was good," he said. "Then people started coming with offers. They said someone wanted to buy land in the area. Big plans. They offered money that sounded fair. Some people accepted, others didn't." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When I refused, strange things started happening. Tools went missing, water lines broke. Livestock got loose without reason, nothing serious enough to prove anything, but enough to make life harder." She nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I saw. I thought leaving would solve it," he said. "I packed up and moved on." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet regret. She looked at him gently. "You did what you thought was right at the time." He gave a small nod, but his eyes remained distant. They continued riding until midday, when they stopped beneath a cluster of trees near a shallow stream. The horses rested while they ate quietly. The air felt warmer, and birds moved through the branches overhead. She took out the wrapped papers again and this time opened them slightly more. Inside were lists of land transfers, signatures, and dates. "These names," she said, pointing to a few lines. "They appear again and again, people who sold under pressure." He studied the pages carefully. One name caught his attention immediately. His expression hardened. "I know this man," he said, "or at least I know of him." "Who is he?" she asked. "Someone who doesn't do his own work," the cowboy replied. "Someone who stays hidden while others do the dirty jobs." The realization settled heavily between them. The gang chasing them was only part of a larger plan. Suddenly, the woman understood something. "That means this isn't just about one town, it's happening everywhere." He nodded slowly. "And if that's true, stopping them won't be easy." She looked down at the papers again. "But if people see this, they'll know the truth." He admired her determination. Despite everything she had faced, she still believed that truth could change things. As they prepared to continue, a distant sound reached them again, faint but unmistakable. "Riders. They're closer than before," she said. He listened carefully. "Yes." Instead of riding immediately, he studied the surrounding terrain. A narrow path led into a dense area of rock formations where visibility would be limited. "We go that way," he decided. They moved quickly into the rocky terrain. Large stone pillars rose around them like silent watchers. The shadows created confusing patterns, making it difficult for anyone to track their exact direction. After some time, they slowed to allow the horses to recover. The woman's confidence seemed stronger now. She asked questions about strategy and watched how he chose each path. "You've done this before," she said. He gave a faint smile. "I've traveled enough to know how to stay unseen." Their conversation began to feel easier, less guarded. They shared small stories about their lives before all of this began. She spoke about working for a ranch owner who trusted her with records and accounts. That was how she discovered the hidden documents. "I wasn't looking for trouble," she said. "It just found me." He understood that feeling well. As the afternoon light softened, they reached a high plateau that overlooked another valley. From there, they could see riders moving far below, searching different paths. "They're spreading out," she said. "That means they're worried," he replied. For the first time, hope flickered between them. They decided to rest briefly. Sitting on a rock, she watched the wind move through the tall grass below. "What happens when we reach safety?" she asked quietly. He considered the question. "That depends on what you want." "I want this to end," she said firmly. "Not just for me, for everyone they've hurt." He studied her face and saw not just fear, but courage. "That will mean standing up to them," he said. She nodded. "Then that's what we do." He felt something shift inside him. For years, he had avoided fights that could drag him back into old pain, but now running felt wrong. As evening approached, they began moving again. The light turned golden, casting long shadows across the ground. The land felt peaceful, almost too peaceful considering the danger behind them. When they reached a small abandoned cabin, they decided to stop for the night. The structure provided shelter, and the surrounding trees offered cover. Inside, dust covered everything, but the place felt safe enough for a short rest. They built a small hidden fire and sat quietly. "You didn't have to stay with me," she said softly. "You could have left after helping me escape the first time." He looked into the flames. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes you meet someone at the right moment, and turning away feels worse than facing the risk." She smiled faintly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant movement. The chase was not over yet, but something important had changed. They were no longer two strangers trying to survive. They had discovered that their pasts were connected by the same enemy, and that realization gave them a new kind of strength. As the fire burned low and night deepened around them, both understood that the road ahead would lead toward confrontation, not escape. And for the first time, neither of them felt completely afraid of that future. The night around the small cabin felt unusually still. The wind had calmed, and the sky above was filled with quiet stars. Inside, the small fire had burned down to a soft glow. The cowboy remained awake longer than usual, listening carefully to every sound beyond the thin wooden walls. He knew the riders were still searching. Men like that did not give up easily, especially when something important was at risk. Across the room, the young woman sat with her back against the wall, holding the wrapped papers close to her chest. She was not asleep either. Her eyes reflected the firelight, and there was determination in them now. Fear had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. "They won't stop until they're sure I can't speak," she said quietly. He nodded. "That means we don't wait for them to decide what happens next." She studied him carefully. "What are you thinking?" He stood and walked to the small window. Outside, darkness covered the land, but the moon gave enough light to see distant shapes. He turned back toward her. "There's a town about half a day from here," he said. "Small but strong, I know someone there, a man who once believed in doing things the right way." "You trust him?" she asked. "I did," the cowboy replied honestly. "I just don't know if he's still the same." She stood slowly. "It's better than running forever," he agreed. Before dawn, they prepared to leave. The air was cold, and their breath formed small clouds as they stepped outside. The horses were ready, though tired from constant movement. As they rode toward the town, the cowboy felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had not returned to that place in years. He had left without saying much, carrying his own quiet disappointment. The sun rose slowly, lighting the hills in soft gold. As they approached the outskirts of town, wooden buildings came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys, and a few early workers moved through the streets. The cowboy slowed his horse. He noticed familiar landmarks, the general store, the water tower, the old fence near the stable. Time had passed, but not everything had changed. The woman looked around carefully. "You've been here before." "Yes," he said simply. They rode down the main street. Some townspeople glanced at them with curiosity. The cowboy kept his expression calm and guided them toward a modest building near the center, the sheriff's office. He dismounted first and helped her down. Together, they stepped inside. Behind a wooden desk sat a man with gray in his beard and steady eyes. He looked up slowly, and for a brief moment recognition flickered across his face. "Well," the sheriff said quietly, standing, "I didn't expect to see you again." The cowboy gave a small nod. "Didn't expect to come back." The sheriff's gaze shifted to the young woman. "Trouble?" "Yes," she answered before the cowboy could speak. "And we need help." The sheriff listened as they explained everything, the pressure on landowners, the abandoned ranches, the hidden records. The cowboy watched carefully, trying to read the sheriff's reaction. At first, the sheriff remained silent. His hands rested on the desk as he studied the papers she carefully unfolded. "These names," he said slowly, "I've heard whispers." "That's not enough," she said firmly. "People are losing everything." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "You understand what you're asking. The people behind this have influence, money, connections." The cowboy met his old friend's eyes. "And if no one stands up?" A long silence followed. Outside, the town began its normal morning routine. Wagons rolled past. Children ran along the wooden sidewalks. Life continued as if nothing was wrong. Finally, the sheriff stood. "If this is true," he said, holding up the papers, "then we do this properly. We gather statements. We call a public meeting. We make sure the truth is seen." Relief and tension mixed in the woman's expression. "They'll try to stop it." "Then we prepare." the sheriff replied calmly. Word spread quickly through the town that a meeting would be held that evening. Curiosity turned into quiet conversation. Some people looked nervous, others looked hopeful. Meanwhile, the cowboy remained alert. He knew the gang would not ignore this move. If they were nearby, they would act. By afternoon, he spotted riders at the edge of town. They did not enter openly, but their presence was clear. "They're here," he told the sheriff quietly. The sheriff nodded. "Let them watch." As evening approached, townspeople gathered inside the largest hall. Lanterns lit the room, casting warm light across worried faces. The air buzzed with tension. The young woman stood near the front, holding the papers tightly. The cowboy stood a few steps behind her, steady and watchful. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. "We're here to hear something important," he said. "Listen carefully." The woman stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, but she forced herself to speak clearly. She explained what she had seen, how families had been pressured, how land had changed hands under fear. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some faces showed recognition. Then the cowboy stepped forward. He spoke not with anger, but with honesty. He shared his own experience from years before, how small problems had grown until leaving felt like the only choice. People listened. Slowly, nods appeared. Outside, shadows moved near the hall. The doors suddenly opened, and several riders stepped inside. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes, scanned the room. "This is a mistake," he said calmly. "You're stirring up things that don't concern you." The sheriff stood firm. "They concern this town." The room grew very quiet. The leader smiled slightly. "You don't want trouble." The cowboy stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "No one here is looking for it." The tension in the air felt heavy, but no one moved recklessly. Townspeople stood together, shoulder to shoulder. The leader realized something important. This was no longer one person running alone. This was a community aware of the truth. After a long moment, he turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "No," the cowboy replied. "It's just beginning." The riders left, their presence no longer as confident as before. Inside the hall, the sheriff addressed the crowd again. "We take this forward," he said, "officially, properly, and together." Applause did not erupt, but something stronger filled the room, resolve. Later that night, as the hall emptied, the woman stepped outside into the cool air. The cowboy joined her. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "They might," he said, "but now they know they can't scare everyone into silence." She looked up at the stars. "I was so focused on escaping, I didn't realize standing still could be stronger." He gave a faint smile. "Running feels safe, but sometimes standing is braver." In the distance, riders disappeared into the darkness. Their power no longer felt absolute. The town had chosen not to look away. And for the first time since the chase began, the cowboy and the young woman were not just surviving, they were fighting back, not with force, but with unity and truth. The storm had not passed yet. But now they were ready to face it together. The morning after the meeting felt different from all the mornings before it. The town woke up slowly, but there was a new kind of energy in the air. People stepped outside their homes with quiet determination instead of fear. Conversations happened in open daylight, not behind closed doors. The cowboy stood near the edge of the main street, watching the sun rise over the rooftops. He had not slept much, but he did not feel tired. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The young woman walked toward him from the sheriff's office. She had spent part of the night organizing the papers and helping prepare official statements. Though she still looked tired, her eyes were steady. "The sheriff sent riders at dawn," she said. "They're carrying copies of the records to neighboring towns. He wants this known everywhere before anyone tries to bury it." The cowboy nodded slowly. "That's smart." She stood beside him, looking down the street. "Do you think it will work?" "It already is," he said quietly. "People aren't hiding anymore." Throughout the day, families came forward with their own stories. Some had accepted unfair offers. Others had been pressured with threats disguised as advice. A few had left without saying goodbye to neighbors, believing they had no choice. Now they were speaking. The sheriff worked carefully, making sure everything was recorded properly. He sent word to officials beyond the region who had authority to investigate. The town moved with patience instead of panic, but everyone knew the matter was not finished. By midday, news arrived that the gang's leader had been seen heading toward a larger city to seek protection from powerful friends. That confirmed what the woman had discovered. This had never been just a local problem. The cowboy listened to the report without surprise. He'll try to save himself, he said. Will he succeed? She asked. Not if enough people stand together. That afternoon, the cowboy walked beyond the town limits toward open land. The young woman followed him. They reached a small hill overlooking fields that once belonged to families who had been forced out. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. The land looked peaceful, but it carried history. I almost left again, he admitted quietly, when this started. I thought helping you escape was enough. She looked at him carefully. But you stayed, he nodded. Running felt easier, staying felt right. She smiled faintly. I'm glad you chose right. They sat on the hill for a long time, speaking little. Silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt steady. Over the next several days, progress came slowly but clearly. More documents surfaced. Neighboring towns shared similar stories. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Investigators from outside the region began asking questions, reviewing land transfers, and examining signatures. The gang's power started to weaken. Some of its members left quietly, seeking distance from trouble. Others tried to deny involvement, but the evidence grew stronger. One evening, word arrived that the leader had been formally accused of fraud and illegal pressure tactics. His allies distanced themselves quickly when they saw the strength of public attention. The young woman listened as the sheriff delivered the news. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. It's really happening, she whispered. The cowboy stood nearby, arms folded. Truth takes time, he said, but it travels. The town gathered again, this time not out of fear, but relief. There was no celebration filled with loud cheering. Instead, there was quiet pride. People shook hands. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stood side by side. Later that night, the cowboy and the young woman walked along the edge of town where the land stretched open once more. What will you do now? She asked gently. He looked toward the horizon. I've spent years moving from place to place, telling myself I didn't need roots. And now, he glanced at her. Now I'm not so sure. She hesitated before speaking again. Some of the abandoned land will return to families. Some pieces will need caretakers. He understood what she was suggesting. Are you asking me to stay? He asked quietly. I'm asking if you want to. The question settled between them like a final test. He thought about the ranch he had once left behind, the regret, the feeling of unfinished business. He realized something important: leaving had never truly freed him. It had only delayed facing what mattered. I think, he said slowly, it's time I stopped riding away. A soft smile touched her face. In the following weeks, the town began rebuilding what had been damaged. Fences were repaired, fields were cleared. Families returned to land they thought they had lost forever. The cowboy helped wherever he was needed. He fixed broken gates, guided cattle, and taught young workers skills he had learned over years of travel. People who once saw him as a stranger now greeted him by name. The young woman worked alongside the sheriff and other officials to ensure fair agreements were restored. She used her knowledge of records to protect families from future schemes. Her courage had sparked change, and she continued to guard it carefully. One afternoon, they stood together at the edge of a newly repaired ranch. Children laughed nearby as they ran through open grass. It doesn't look the same as before, she said. No, he agreed. It looks stronger. She turned toward him. Do you ever regret coming back? He shook his head. I regret not doing it sooner. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm colors once again, much like the evening when their paths first crossed. Only now everything felt different. They were no longer running from riders in the distance. They were standing on land filled with possibility. As the wind moved gently across the plains, the cowboy realized that saving her had also saved him. Facing the same enemy had given them both something unexpected, a chance to rebuild not only a community, but themselves. The road ahead would still hold challenges. Life always did, but this time he would not ride alone into the sunset. This time he would stay.